since 2016, the sport's changed a lot.
Yeah.
I can imagine, like from the outside, it certainly has, and from the inside, probably even more, right? Or maybe not.
No. Well, it depends what you mean by change. It depends. Obviously, the drivers change all the time. The attitude in terms of how Formula One has progressed since obviously Drive to Survive. We've talked about. I'm sure you've talked about that countless times. Everyone has. And yes, there is a lot more people that are coming to events now. We have a lot more issues with things like traffic jams. Hotels are very expensive. Flights are more expensive. But also it's great. There's more people that are coming. It's a wonderful thing to see. And just in the way that we consume Formula One has massively changed, obviously with TikTok and all the various ways social media has changed. So yeah, in that way, I guess, you're right, it has changed quite a lot. But in terms of like the core idea of Formula One, I wouldn't say that's changed. Yeah. I think that's still...
I guess it's kind of a gradual, isn't it? Each year something happens which doesn't feel maybe significant in isolation, but then you spread that from 2016 to 2023. Yeah. And all of a sudden it all adds up.
Well, if you think about 2016, like one of my first races was when Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton had clashed. So it must have been, it couldn't have been Spain. I think it was Austria. Did they clash in Austria in 2016?
When didn't they?
Exactly. My memory.
They did, yeah. They did.
And so I had this thing. So it was my first ever race working for 5 Live. And obviously for 5 Live, they were like, Lewis Hamilton, we need Lewis Hamilton. I was like, fine, okay, Lewis. And obviously Nico had crashed. So he was the first out and he came out, the way he always used to, kind of walked over, looked around the pen and went straight to me. And it was my first ever race. So it was, for me, I was like, okay, the German has just come over to me I'm waiting for Lewis Hamilton. Okay, fine, let's go. So I got the first sort of response of him being incredibly frustrated and upset of Lewis Hamilton, and me just going down to my producer. So that was Nico. He spoke to us first, so he's quite angry. Okay, thanks. But I just remember being like, why is it come to me? Because usually the way they do it, they kind of go to the nationalities and then they'll come to us sort of thing. But yeah, it just completely beelined for me and just was like, I was like, okay. I don't know what to say.
Do you think that was maybe because you were a new face and he just, I don't know.
Maybe I looked safe.
Have you ever asked him since, like, about that at all?
I don't think he's going to remember me from that one moment. It might be more of a me memory than a him memory. No is the answer to that. But yeah, it could have been that I was new. Usually new faces, they're a little bit more kind of standoffish with because it takes a long time to build trust with drivers. And once you build a nice trust, you can have that sort of nicer relationship with them. But when you first sort of meet them, they can be a bit like, not sure about you. And they work you out and then they kind of work out whether they like you or don't like you from that, basically.
I can imagine. Like, obviously that was your first kind of insight, 2016, and what a battle you signed up for as well when you first jumped in. Are you getting any kind of, because there's been a lot of talk obviously about Lewis and George right now, and I think the similarities are quite clear from the outside looking in, but are you getting that same sense of that type of fight, or was that different? I get, because they were fighting for a championship. So there's an internal, it's all well and good talking about internal rivalries, but when you're fighting for a championship, I think fair enough, the gloves kind of come off. I think when you're not fighting for a championship, for me, it's silly, it's counterproductive to the overall cause. But I mean, Toto signed up for another 2 years of George and Lewis, and it's like, they're not even fighting for wins yet, and they're tripping over loads.
I heard you guys talking about this in your last podcast, and I sort of agree. It was funny because I was listening and I was like, I haven't really thought about it in the way that they're obviously two rivals because they're just not fighting for a championship, of course. It's an interesting dynamic because Lewis is obviously the senior member. And when they clashed at the beginning of Qatar, I remember thinking, this is going to be really unhappy Lewis Hamilton coming over because he had already said on the radio how unhappy he was. And so I didn't know which way it was going to go. George on the radio was really different. And I asked George about this as well. George went, I'm very angry he crashed into me. And then he went, oh no, I can't, 5 minutes. And look, we get delayed radio, so don't get me wrong. The radios are picked and chosen for what, Formula One decide that we should hear. But the initial radio was, I'm really angry, he just crashed into me. And then he was like, oh, actually, I kind of, I've taken a step back a bit. Lewis, however, we only heard the sort of, I've been taken out by my teammate, team radio. But obviously after that, he was out of the car. So the radio is, is no longer. So when he came over to us, I thought, I saw him in the TV pen first because he goes to the TV pen, then he'll come over to us as written media. And I was trying to work out his body language, because with Lewis, you can kind of tell quite quickly what his body language is, in terms of if he's going to be in a kind of give you a lot of words mood, or maybe a bit more, you know, 1 or 2 words. And he seemed all right in TV. So I was like, maybe he'll be okay. And he came over and he was absolutely fine. He didn't do the line at the point because he took to Twitter to say, I 100% think it was my fault. But he came over and he said, look, I'm the senior member here. And I get that. It looks like it probably was my fault. And I thought that was really interesting language, because I was like, it looks like it's my fault because I'm the senior member. And I was like, so you're taking the blame because you're the senior member. That's not quite how it's going to work. But from what you guys were talking about last week, I was like, that is a quote that's really now playing on my mind, because yes, afterwards he took 100% fault for it. But at the point of heat, which is not a time that we always take exactly what the drivers think, because remember, there's adrenaline and all sorts of, they've just stepped out. 100%. But it was really interesting that he used that wording, I'm the senior member of the team.
Yeah.
And I thought, I wonder what he means by that. Does that mean that he sees himself as like the senior member and therefore still number one? Or does he see himself as a senior member as a mentor role? Like, how does he mean that senior member role? So yeah, it's interesting. If these battles continue, there has to be a question that's asked about, you know, they don't want to get to a Nico and Lewis stage. They don't want to end up
not at all
perceiving in the car that they hate each other. That's obviously not what they've said, but, you know, that was the rumors at the time. You know, they don't want that. They want harmony. But at the same time, you can't have harmony. You've got to have 2 races that are fighting at the same time. So it'll be interesting to see how that progresses as it goes on.
This is what I mean. It does feel like, you know, Toto's spoken in the past about, you know, that Hamilton-Bottas dynamic was such an amazing dynamic. You know, Bottas never missed Q3 in 5 years at that team. So he was always there, but Lewis almost always had, pretty much always had the leg over him. It was like 30-70 in terms of like qualifying head-to-head over the course of their careers. So I think that, you know, Toto's signed up for this for 2 more years. And you can obviously, individually, their talents are unquestionable. But I mean, they've got a big upgrade this weekend. Mercedes coming as well. So, like, do you think, because someone's going to catch Red Bull eventually, it's going to be somebody.
Yeah.
I think you've got Mercedes, their driver lineup, potentially the Achilles heel, even if the car gets there, because Red Bull have this clear 1-2. Yeah. McLaren, you could argue Piastri's getting close. He's maybe not too close. You know, Charles and Carlos at Ferrari. You know, do you think Mercedes have the pieces, because, you know, Allison's back in with the F1 team now, they've got the pedigree, they've got Lewis really pushing, seemingly like talking about this next, you know, this off-season development needs to be the best development they've ever done. You know, do you think Mercedes will, if you had to say today, do you think Mercedes will be that team? Because it's going to be one of them that catches them first, but McLaren looks so...
Do you know what, this year, and we've talked about it quite a lot in the paddock, 2 drivers, that it's been a year that we always go into a race weekend with a complete unknown. We've never known. We're starting to see a little bit more now of patterns and trends and cars that suit certain tracks. But until the summer break or so, we were a bit like, well, I don't know who this track's going to suit. On paper, it should suit the Aston Martin. On paper, it should suit the Mercedes. And suddenly it was like, everyone just ripped up all those rule books and went, I don't know, let's just throw them on and see what happens. And that's literally what it felt. And you were like, okay, hang on, McLaren did really well at that track, but they didn't do well at that track, but they were meant to do well at that track. So what about Mercedes? Mercedes went to do it. And you're like, oh, I don't know anymore. And I remember the amount of times I've asked like Charles Leclerc, like, how do you think you're going to fare this weekend? And he's like, I don't know. Yeah. I'm like, great.
If even they don't know, then exactly. What are we meant to do?
I know, exactly. And you know, and then there's just so many unknowns, and we've got to have a whole new unknown thrown in for Las Vegas because we've got cold weather.
Yep.